The gang of 4 teenage boys had been filming pranks on strangers for months, chasing followers, chasing likes, chasing the strange hollow high of watching numbers climb on a phone screen. That afternoon in the park, they found what they thought was the easiest target of their lives, a 74-year-old man sitting alone on a bench with a small bouquet of white lilies in his lap, tossing crumbs to a circle of pigeons. They slapped the flowers from his hands. They stole his cane and held it over their heads like a trophy. They surrounded him while one of them held up a phone, streaming live to hundreds of strangers, who laughed along, certain the old man had no way to fight back. 30 seconds later on that same patch of grass, the laughter stopped completely, because the quiet stranger they had cornered had once been one of the most feared heavyweight champions in the history of American boxing, and what happened next would be watched by millions before the sun went down. But to understand why that moment mattered, why an old man's stillness could feel more dangerous than any punch, you have to go back before the phones, before the bench, before the lilies, back to a life that had been built brick by brick out of loss. Isaiah Brooks had not always been quiet. There had been a time when his name was shouted by 20,000 people at once, when the sound of it rolling off an announcer's tongue could make grown men place bets they couldn't afford to lose. In the ring, he had been something close to a force of nature, fast hands, a jaw that seemed carved from granite, and a discipline that made him nearly impossible to rattle. Sports writers called him the quiet storm because he never trash-talked, never postured, never needed to. He let his fists do what his mouth refused to. He had grown up in a small apartment above a laundromat, raised by a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who left before Isaiah could remember his face. Boxing had found him, the way it finds a lot of boys with too much anger and nowhere to put it, a gym 3 blocks from home, a coach who saw something in him before he saw it in himself. By 19, he was undefeated. By 25, he held a title belt that most fighters spend their whole careers chasing and never touch. It was around that time that he met Clara. She wasn't impressed by the belt. That was the first thing he noticed about her. She worked at the hospital where he'd gone to get stitches after a sparring cut opened up wrong. And when he tried to charm her with his name, she simply asked, "Does that mean you'll actually let me clean the wound properly? Or are you going to flinch like every other man in here?" He didn't flinch. He also didn't stop thinking about her for the next 2 weeks until he worked up the nerve to show up at the hospital with a bouquet of white lilies because he'd overheard a nurse mention they were her favorite. They married 18 months later. Isaiah kept fighting, kept winning, kept climbing, but every mention of Clara in interviews softened something in his voice that reporters couldn't quite explain. "She's the reason I fight clean," he told one journalist. "A man who has someone waiting for him at home doesn't need to prove anything to strangers." Their daughter, Naomi, was born the year he won his second title defense. Isaiah has told people since that holding her for the first time felt heavier than any belt he'd ever lifted. And, stranger still, it felt like the first time winning had actually meant something. For 4 years, life had a rhythm to it that felt almost unfairly good. Fights on the weekends, family in the evenings, Clara's laughter filling the small house they'd bought outside the city. Isaiah used to joke that he'd gotten 2 undefeated records, one in the ring and one at home. Then came the accident. It was a rain-slicked road on a Tuesday evening. Nothing dramatic in the telling of it, which somehow made it worse. Clara was driving home from her sister's house with 4-year-old Naomi asleep in the back seat when another car ran a red light. Clara didn't survive the impact. Naomi, by some mercy neither cruel nor kind enough to explain, walked away with only a broken arm and a memory she would spend years trying not to have. Isaiah was 2 weeks out from the biggest fight of his career when he got the phone call. He didn't remember much of what happened after. Reporters would say later that he simply vanished from the sport. No announcement, no farewell tour, no explanation beyond a single statement released through his manager. "My family needs me more than boxing does." He never fought again. The public speculated for years. Some assumed an injury. Some assumed money trouble. Few assumed he'd lost his nerve. None of them knew the truth because Isaiah never told it. He simply sold the house that held too many memories, moved into a modest apartment near a park with a pond and a row of old oak trees, and devoted the next 3 decades of his life to raising his daughter and disappearing from a world that had once known his name. In every household, he worked quietly, first as a mechanic, later doing odd maintenance jobs for a local community center, always saying yes when someone needed help moving furniture or fixing a leaking roof, never mentioning what his hands used to be capable of in a ring. Naomi grew up not entirely understanding why her father flinched at applause, why he changed the channel whenever boxing came on the television, why he kept a single photograph of her mother on a nightstand and nowhere else in the house, as if the rest of the walls couldn't be trusted with her memory. "Why don't you ever talk about when you were famous?" Naomi asked him once, maybe 12 years old, having found an old newspaper clipping in a box in the closet. Isaiah had looked at the photograph of his younger self for a long moment, fists raised, face fierce, nothing like the man sitting in front of her. That man didn't know what mattered yet. He said, "I'd rather you know your father as the man who does." Naomi grew up, went to college, became a nurse like her mother had been, moved to states away for work, called every Sunday. Isaiah stayed behind in the small apartment by the park because the park was where he'd met Clara's favorite flowers, and because leaving felt like abandoning the last place that still remembered her. Every single day, rain or shine, he walked to the same bench near the pond with a small bouquet of white lilies, sat, and fed the birds. It wasn't sentimentality exactly, or maybe it was exactly that, but Isaiah never described it that way. He called it keeping a promise. Long ago, Clara had told him that if anything ever happened to her, she didn't want flowers left at a grave she wouldn't be aware of. She wanted them left somewhere alive, somewhere birds sang and children played and the world kept moving. So every day, for over 30 years, Isaiah brought her lilies to the park instead of a cemetery, because some promises are meant to be kept in motion rather than carved in stone. To the people who passed him on their afternoon walks, he was simply the old man who fed the birds, kind, quiet, unremarkable in the way that elderly men on park benches are so often assumed to be unremarkable, as if a long life were the same thing as an empty one. Children in the neighborhood knew him differently. He'd taught half of them how to play chess on a small folding board he kept in his bag, patient with their mistakes in a way most adults weren't. Parents trusted him instinctively, the way people trust kindness they've witnessed repeatedly over years rather than assumed from a single glance. He'd quietly paid for school supplies for families he heard were struggling, always through the community center, always anonymously, always waving off thanks before it could properly land on him. He believed, with the same conviction he'd once believed in his own right hook, that violence should always be the very last option a person reaches for, and only when every other option had already failed. It wasn't weakness. It was a decision he had made, deliberately, forged in the specific furnace of having once been strong enough to hurt people and choosing every day since not to, which is exactly why what happened that spring took the whole neighborhood by surprise. Everyone except Isaiah himself, who had always known that the day might come when kindness alone wouldn't be enough to keep the people he loved safe. The 4 teenagers who found him didn't know any of this. They didn't know about Clara or Naomi or the belt gathering dust in a box somewhere or the sacrifice that had quietly reshaped an entire life. They saw an old man with a cane and a bouquet of flowers, sitting by himself, feeding birds, and to them he looked like content, easy content, the kind that generates views without generating consequences. Their leader was a 17-year-old named Tyler, the kind of boy who had discovered that cruelty filmed and uploaded could feel a lot like power when you didn't otherwise have any. His 3 friends followed his lead the way certain boys always do at that age, less out of conviction, and more out of the fear of being the one left out, or worse, the one targeted. Next, the first day, they only mocked him, commented loudly about his age, imitated his slow walk, laughed when he didn't respond. Isaiah simply gathered his things and left early, saying nothing, betraying nothing. The second day, they came back, emboldened by how little resistance they'd met. This time, they knocked his cane out from under him. He caught himself on the bench arm before he fell, straightened his jacket, and sat back down as if nothing had happened. The pigeons scattered, then slowly returned, the way they do. By the third visit, it had become something close to a game for them and the audience. Watching the live streams had begun to grow. They spilled his bag of birdseed into the dirt. They stepped on the lilies he'd brought that morning, grinding the white petals into the gravel path. They called him names meant to wound rather than merely tease. Old, useless, pathetic, words chosen with the particular cruelty that teenagers can sometimes manage when they haven't yet learned what words actually cost. Isaiah never raised his voice. Each time, he simply looked at them with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite pity, and said some version of the same sentence. You boys still have time to become better men. It should have shamed them. Instead, his calm seemed to provoke them further, the way a door that won't slam shut in anger becomes, to certain people, a door they feel compelled to break down. They mistook his restraint for weakness, which is one of the oldest and most dangerous mistakes a bully can make about the people they've chosen to target. The live streams kept growing. What had started as a dare between four bored teenagers had become, without any of them quite realizing the shift, a kind of ongoing performance, with an audience numbering in the hundreds then the low thousands. Comments urged them on. Strangers online, hidden behind usernames, cheered for the humiliation of a man they had never met and would never have to look in the eye. Isaiah kept coming back anyway. Friends at the community center urged him to go to the police, to change his route, to bring someone with him. He refused each time, gently but firmly. This is Clara's place, he told the center's director, an old friend named Marcus who had known him for over 20 years. I'm not going to let four boys chase me out of the one place I still talk to her. Marcus didn't understand it fully, but he understood enough not to argue. He did, however, quietly begin stopping by the park himself in the afternoons, standing at a distance, watching, worried, though never quite catching the worst of it in person, because the boys were careful to time their cruelty for when Isaiah was alone. Isaiah, for his part, was not so much enduring the bullying as he was making a calculation, one that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the promise he'd made himself 30 years earlier, a promise older and heavier than any humiliation for teenagers could throw at him. He had decided, back when Clara died, that he would never again let his hands be the first answer to a problem. He would exhaust every gentler option. First, he would absorb what he could absorb. He would speak plainly and hope plainness might eventually land. It rarely occurred to people watching that his stillness was not an absence of strength, but the presence of an enormous, deliberate restraint. The same restraint that had once made him nearly unbeatable in a ring, now turned inward and aimed at himself instead of an opponent. What none of them accounted for was the one thing that had always been true about Isaiah. Brooks, in the ring and out of it, he would take almost anything the world threw at him, personally, but he had never, not once in his life, been able to stand by while someone else's child was hurt in front of him. The afternoon, everything changed, began ordinarily enough. Isaiah was sitting on his usual bench, the sun low and gold through the oak trees, a small chessboard folded open beside him. An 8-year-old boy named Julian, whose mother worked afternoon shifts nearby and often left him with Isaiah for 20 minutes while she ran to pick up his younger sister, was sitting across from him, frowning hard at a chess position Isaiah had set up specifically to teach him about protecting his king. You're leaving him open, Isaiah said, tapping gently near the boy's knight. Every piece on this board has a job, even the ones that don't look important. Julian's mother had stepped away only a few minutes earlier, promising she'd be back before the end of the next chapter of whatever story Isaiah was telling him. It was during those few minutes that Tyler and his friend arrived, phone already raised, clearly having decided this particular afternoon would be the one. They escalated things, the algorithm. After all, always wants more. Tyler grabbed Julian's backpack off the bench first, tossing it to one of his friends like, "Hey, game of keep away." Julian, startled and scared, reached for it, and in the scramble, Tyler shoved him, not gently, not as an accident, but hard enough that the boy went down onto the gravel path, scraping his palms, crying out in surprise more than pain. Something in Isaiah's posture changed in that instant, and anyone who had known him during his fighting years would have recognized it immediately as stillness that wasn't passivity, but readiness, the exact quiet that used to fall over him in the seconds before a bell rang. He rose from the bench slowly, but there was nothing frail in the motion anymore. His voice, when it came, had none of its usual softness. "I asked you to leave," he said. "Now I'm telling you." Tyler, riding the high of the moment and the small audience of his friends and the invisible audience watching through his phone, laughed. "Or what, old man?" He threw the first punch. What happened over the next several seconds would be replayed, frame by frame, by millions of people within the week, analyzed and slowed down and captioned with disbelief, because it did not look like an old man getting lucky. It looked, to anyone who understood the sport even slightly, like something else entirely. Isaiah slipped the punch with barely any wasted motion, the kind of movement that looks almost lazy until you realize how little effort it actually costs someone who has spent a lifetime perfecting it. His counter came a half second later, a single control body shot that folded Tyler forward, followed immediately by a short, precise hook that put him on the ground before he understood he was falling. One of Tyler's friends, either out of loyalty or panic, lunged forward. Isaiah turned, caught his wrist, redirected his own momentum against him, and had him face down on the grass. Within 2 seconds, disarmed and unhurt beyond the shock of it. The other two didn't move again. They simply stood there, phone still recording, mouths open, watching a 74-year-old man stand calmly over their friend without a single hair out of place, breathing exactly as steadily as he had been breathing a minute earlier. Isaiah didn't gloat. He didn't even raise his voice again. He knelt down first, not toward Tyler, but toward Julian, checking the boy's scraped palms, speaking to him gently until the crying stopped. Only after that did he turn back to the 4 teenagers, his expression unreadable. "Go home," he said, "and think about what you almost became today." The live stream, still running the entire time, had over 4,000 people watching by the moment Isaiah spoke those words. The chat, which had been full of mocking laughter minutes earlier, had gone almost entirely silent, replaced by a flood of a single repeated question typed by hundreds of strangers at once. Who is this old man? It took less than an hour for someone to find out. A retired sports reporter named Daniel Ferris, scrolling through his phone that evening out of habit rather than any expectation, stopped cold on the clip somebody had already reposted with the caption, "Old man beats up bullies." Ferris had covered boxing for almost 40 years. He recognized the footwork before he recognized the face, a very specific, economical shift of weight that he hadn't seen since covering fights in the early 90s. That's not just any old man, he wrote in a post that would itself go viral within the day. That's Isaiah Brooks, former heavyweight champion, disappeared from the sport over 30 years ago, and nobody ever really knew why. The story detonated across social media with the particular speed reserved for things that feel too good, too strange, too satisfying to be entirely true. Within 2 days, news outlets that hadn't mentioned boxing in years were running segments trying to piece together what had happened to the man who vanished at the peak of his career. Reporters found their way, eventually, to Marcus at the community center, who agreed to Speak only after making it clear he wouldn't share anything Isaiah hadn't already made public himself. He didn't disappear because something went wrong with his career, Marcus told one interviewer carefully. He disappeared because something went wrong with his life, and he chose his daughter over everything else the world was offering him. That's not a scandal. That's just love, if you actually understood him. Old footage resurfaced of Isaiah in his 20s, undefeated, a belt around his waist, a young wife beaming from the front row of the arena, unaware of how little time they had left together. Alongside it ran the story reporters slowly assembled about the following 3 decades, the mechanic job, the anonymous donations that community center records quietly confirmed once families gave permission to speak, the years of chess lessons for neighborhood kids who couldn't afford lessons anywhere else. The birdseed bought every week without fail. The lilies bought every single day for 30 years for a wife who had been gone almost as long as she'd been alive to him. People who had once only known him as a bullied old man on a bench were now encountering, all at once, the fuller truth of who had been sitting there the entire time. The internet, so often quick to mock and quicker to forget, found itself instead confronted with something it hadn't expected to feel, a kind of collective, aching respect. Julian's mother, once she learned the full story, brought her son back to the park the very next week, not out of obligation, but because Julian had asked to see Mr. Isaiah again, still slightly in awe of what he'd witnessed, still processing that the gentle man who taught him chess had once been strong enough to do what he'd done and had chosen, every day before that, not to. Tyler and his friends did not escape the consequences of that afternoon, though what awaited them was not the internet pile-on many expected. The video's virality had made anonymity impossible. Their identities surfaced within days, their families contacted by school officials, and, more painfully for the boys, by their own parents who had to watch the footage themselves and reckon with what their sons had become capable of doing to another human being for the sake of an audience. Tyler's mother, a nurse who worked long shifts to support her son after his father left the picture, wept when she watched the clip in full for the first time, not primarily because of what her son had done, though that alone would have been enough, but because she recognized with a kind of sick clarity how much of it had been building quietly for months. Without her noticing, buried under school stress and unspoken anger and the particular loneliness that pushes some teenagers toward cruelty as a substitute for belonging. She brought Tyler to the community center herself, unannounced, and asked Marcus if there was any way her son could apologize to Mr. Brooks in person. Isaiah agreed to meet them, though not at the park. He chose instead a quiet room at the center, no phones allowed, no cameras, nothing performative about it at all. Tyler came in first, and for the first time since any of this had started, he looked less like a boy chasing followers and more like exactly what he was, 17 years old, frightened, ashamed, out of his depth in a way he clearly hadn't anticipated when he'd first raised his phone in that park. "I'm sorry," he said, and it came out smaller than he probably meant it to. "I don't even know why we kept doing it. It felt like a joke at first, and then it didn't feel like it was real. Like you weren't really a person, you were just content." Isaiah listened without interrupting, the way he had listened to Julian, the way he had once listened to Clara describe her day at the hospital, fully, without rushing toward his own response. "That's the part that should scare you more than anything else," Isaiah said finally. "Not that you hurt an old man, that you stopped seeing a person at all. That's how every cruel thing in history got started, somebody deciding the person in front of them wasn't fully real." Tyler didn't have an answer for that, and Isaiah didn't seem to expect one. "I'm not going to pretend what you did doesn't matter," Isaiah continued. "It does. Your friend is going to carry a bruise for a week. Julian is going to remember being pushed to the ground for a lot longer than that. But I've lived long enough to know that boys your age can still become something different than what they've already shown you they can be. That's not forgiveness exactly, It's just a chance. What you do with it is up to you. Why didn't you fight back sooner? Tyler asked quietly, the question that seemed to have been sitting under all his shame the entire time. You could have any of those days. Why'd you wait? Isaiah considered the question for a long moment before answering. Because I made a decision a long time ago, after I lost someone I loved very much, that I would never let my hands be the first thing I reach for, he said. Violence was never hard for me. That's the part people never understood about being good at it. The hard part isn't throwing the punch. The hard part is choosing not to, over and over, even when everyone around you thinks that means you're weak. I waited because I needed to know for certain that there wasn't another way through. The moment I saw that boy on the ground, I knew there wasn't. He paused, and something in his voice softened, not with forgiveness exactly, but with a kind of weary hope that only comes from having survived enough to still believe change is possible in other people. Real strength isn't about knocking someone down, Isaiah said. It's about choosing not to every single time you're able to. I'm hoping someday you understand that from the inside, instead of just hearing it from me. The other three boys, one by one over the following weeks, offered their own apologies, some more genuine than others, though Marcus reported that at least two of them had started volunteering at the community center afterward, quietly, without cameras, doing the kind of unremarkable good that never trends online but sometimes actually changes a person. The story of Isaiah Brooks did not end with a viral clip or a tidy apology, because real stories rarely resolve themselves that neatly. What changed in the months that followed was smaller and stranger than the internet's appetite for redemption arcs usually wants. People in the neighborhood started greeting him differently, not with fear and not exactly with fame, but with a kind of quiet respect that hadn't been there before. The respect owed to someone whose gentleness, it turned out, had never been the absence of strength, but its most disciplined form. He still walks to the same bench every single afternoon. He still brings a small bouquet of white lilies, still tosses crumbs to the same stubborn pigeons who never learned to fear him. Despite everything, Julian still comes by after school some days, a little more careful about chess now, listening a little more closely when Isaiah tells him that every piece on the board has a job, even the ones that don't look important. Reporters occasionally still ask if he'd consider writing a memoir, appearing on some program, capitalizing in any of the small ways available to a man who briefly became famous. Again, at 74 years old, for something he never wanted to become famous for in the first place. Isaiah always declines, politely, the same way he's declined most things the spotlight has offered him since the day he walked away from it 3 decades ago. I already told the only story that mattered to me, he says when pressed. I told it every day for 30 years, to a woman who isn't here to hear it anymore, and to a daughter who grew up because of it. Everything else is just noise. In the evenings now, when the light goes gold through the oak trees and the pond goes still, people passing through the park sometimes slow down near the bench where the old man sits, not because they recognize him from the videos anymore, but because there's something in the stillness of him that seems worth walking past a little slower. A man who had once been strong enough to hurt almost anyone he wanted, and had instead spent his whole life choosing deliberately and daily to be gentle instead. The lilies get replaced every morning. The birds still come, and somewhere in that quiet, ordinary ritual, 30 years of grief and love and restraint keep being kept the way some promises are never meant to be carved in a stone, only lived out one unremarkable afternoon at a time.